All right, so we're live now. Thanks again, everyone, for being with us and for joining this conversation. I'm going to introduce our two special guests, Kris Archie and Shanice Steele. So Kris Archie is a Shuswap. Did I say it right? Shuswap. Shuswap. One day I'm going to pronounce them perfectly. But Kris Archie is Shuswap from the Tuscan First Nation and is passionate about heart-based community work and facilitating positive change. I know Kris Archie from some of the work I do with the Ontario Indigenous Youth Partnership Program. And so Kris is always having these really awesome discussions with within philanthropy and to a lot of white folks that have a lot of power. And so Kris is really one of the first people that really introduced this idea, decentering whiteness. And I think like a lot of us do it, naturally, but it was the first time that someone actually articulated it. And it was like, wow. And so I've been like really conscious of it ever since. And that's about 2 years ago. So yeah, Kris will talk a little bit more about the work she does in a minute. But we also have Shanice Steele with us. Shanice is an Afro-Indigenous activist and writer. Shanice has Métis, Anishinaabe, and Trinidadian roots. And Shanice is also just one of these amazing people that is always decentering whiteness and really being so like gentle and kind about it too. And so I feel like Shanice is one of those people, like she'll just say the truth and you have like no other option but to just be like, yeah, I'm gonna do that. So I feel like we'll have this really great conversation. So I wanted to start off by just, putting it out there to you, Kris. What does decentering whiteness mean to you?
Thank you. Wake and awake, Kris Archie and Squest the Galmuth from Teskin. I am a Sequamic woman, a mother as well of a 20-year-old, and take pretty seriously my responsibility to be an adult ally, to find all kinds of ways to create spaces for young people's voices and decisions that matter and affect them. But one of the biggest gifts in the work that I did alongside young people for a long time is that working with young folks meant that I learned a lot about creating inclusive spaces for all kinds of folks. And I think that decentering whiteness, when I first heard about it, a friend sent me a checklist, and it was a checklist written by a multiracial, multi-generational group of facilitators and dialogue hosts who just were like noticing that in conferences and large gatherings, the way that whiteness was showing up in those spaces was causing harm. And I got this little checklist and was like, whoa, what the hell is this? This is amazing. And it actually was the first time I had language to express the way in which I felt most natural when I was designing events and gatherings, which really at the end of the day, for me, decentering whiteness is about creating a space that favors and prioritizes the bodies, the food, the well-being, and the spiritual needs of BIPOC folks, first and foremost. And that any of the unquestioned ways of gathering or coming together that actually uphold whiteness, that uphold patriarchy and ableism and all of those shitty things, that this gives me a tool and a mechanism to deconstruct that and help others recognize that if we do the work of decentering whiteness in our work, inside of ourselves, in our relationships, and in the events that we have inside of our organizations, I think that it's really an act of liberation. But it's not easy. That's for sure. It's not easy. But I find that the labor of doing it well is always worth the payoff, because the pain of being and living and swimming in this white supremacist world is just too much. And so the labor has always worked out to be worth it for me.
Thanks, Kris. Yeah, and we'll come back to some of the things that you touched on. But yeah, I wanted to ask you the same question, Shanice.
Thanks. I just want to start off by saying like Chimigwich to everyone who said that they were here to like hear me speak. Just my whole heart. Yes, me and Brendan went to university together and definitely shared some adventures dealing with whiteness. So I will say definitely have a strong bond there. Anim bojo buju shnis indishnakas, indobo to go anishnabemnang to Jack and Dodem, Anishnabe Makade Kwe, Toronto Danjaba, Minwa Nabising Danjaba, Debenjganin Nakuya Anishnabek. So my name is Shanice Steele. I am Anishinaabe Métis. My family has connections to Nipissing First Nation, and then my father is Black from the Caribbean, Trinidad and Carriacou. I'm currently on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, so I'm in Barrie right now. But yeah, when it comes to decentering whiteness, what that means to me, I think much like Kris, and the people that had given Kris that list, I was in spaces and conferences, especially in post-secondary conferences, where I realized whiteness and white people were the only things that we were talking about. And even when we were talking about our resilience and our resistance as Indigenous people, as Black people, as racialized people, it still was always all about white people. It was like, how do we get away from white supremacists, and how do we make spaces safer on campus and educate white people, and like, how do we decolonize universities that are white? And it was just like, it felt like every single conversation I was having was about white people and about whiteness. And for me, I was like, when am I going to start talking about Anishinaabe issues and Métis issues and Indigenous issues and Black issues that don't automatically have to be in relationship to white people, right? Like, we understand colonization and oppression is something that, you know, Western European society brought here to us and brought around the world. But at the end of the day, for me, my concerns were more around kinship and more around building community and more around sustainability. And I wanted to start talking about, you know, building relationships between Black and Indigenous peoples, right? Like, the whole conversation around reconciliation, I'm sure we've all said it, reconciliation is dead. But I was tired of talking about reconciling between white settlers. I wanted to know what it meant, even as a Anishinaabe person, you know, what does it mean to reconcile with Haudenosaunee people on these territories, right? What does it mean? What does it mean for us as nations to reconcile with each other in a way that doesn't center whiteness? And so for me, much like Kris, it stopped being about everything else and more about us and more about building up each other. It meant, as someone who went to a predominantly Black high school, what does it mean to then go back to community and support those Black youth and seeing themselves in the future? What does it mean for me as an Afro-Indigenous person, for other young Afro-Indigenous people to see me in the future, to see me doing things? So decentering whiteness to me means focusing more on community, focusing more on kinship, focusing more on building, in a way that doesn't center white people. I would love a conversation where I don't have to mention the word white unless I'm talking about the color. I would love it. So yeah, decentering whiteness to me is very much around centering ourselves and finding ways to do that isn't just about our oppression and isn't just about our suffering, but is more about the things that we are doing, right? Those aunties that are putting in the work, right? That connection to land that we're building again. That to me is decentering whiteness.
For sure. Yeah, I think like just building off of what you've just said, what are some of like the first things that you started doing to really recenter Indigenous and Black folks in your individual life?
For me, to be honest, it was my house. My house was a no white people house. I'm going to be very honest. Me and my roommate made a rule, other than our landlord's husband, that our home would be a white free space. And it's not to say that we don't have white friends, but we needed a space where we could go, where we didn't have to constantly watch ourselves, or, you know, make sure that when we're joking around, we're not like, oh, I can't say this, right? Or make sure that even in our home, we're not censoring whiteness. And that was really important for us in a world where whiteness is everywhere, in our work, in our school, right? And going to the grocery store. We needed a space that was just for us, to be happy and to cry and to be angry and to be free without those eyes. I think that was definitely the first step. I think the second step was to stop wasting my time arguing with white people online. I don't know how much time I've spent doing that. I've realized people who want to learn will learn. They will come to you. They will end up in spaces like this. They will read. They will do the work. And yes, there are people out there who are waiting to learn, but those people, once again, usually aren't the people who are going to spend 2 hours arguing with you online, right? They're not the people who are going to try to justify the dehumanization of your people. And so, yeah, I stopped arguing with white people online. I stopped looking for racism. Actually, I think that's the number one thing. I think as racialized and indigenous people and Black people, we assume that, like, once we become quote unquote woke, that we have to go looking for it, right? We have to go into every room, into every office, into every business, and we have to fight racism. And the reality is racism and white supremacy is everywhere. You don't have to go looking for it, right? It will find you eventually. So I stopped looking for it. I stopped going out of my way to look for racism in places. Because it's tiring. You burn yourself out. You can't fight every single battle, right? So I think it's important to focus on the battles that are coming to you, that you're seeing. I think obviously if there's a cause and you need to take to the streets, that's another thing. But going out of your way to find racism, it's going to burn you out. It's there, it's everywhere. So take the time to, breathe. You don't have to fight constantly. And I think that's the other thing around decentering whiteness, is recognizing that you don't always have to be fighting. Like, you as a racialized indigenous person can take the time to breathe, to feel joy. That was another thing. Decentering whiteness was feeling joy. Like, I didn't have to feel guilty anymore. Like, I recognize that, yes, around the world, Black and indigenous people are suffering, but I don't have to be miserable all of the time. I can be happy. I can feel joy. I can celebrate life. I can celebrate wins, because whiteness wants you to constantly feel down, right? You can't fight if you're constantly feeling down. So yeah, I think those are the top 3 things that I really started doing.
Sweet, that's awesome, awesome advice. And like with A7G, we can totally relate to creating a space that's not for white people. And we really don't have that much trouble like explaining it to people. Like, people just get it. And then there's also like awesome white folks that will just stop by and like order some food for us and then just leave. And like literally, like, that's like Nell's actually on the phone. But like that's like a best practice, and I think like just like from my observations, like in engagement with indigenous youth, like not having to explain ourselves or not having to define who we are constantly is so feels so good. So what about you, Kris? What are some of like the first things you started doing to really recenter your indigeneity?
I think one of the first things that I had to take pretty seriously was my own proximity to whiteness, and recognize, as a biracial woman with a settler father, like 4th generation settler father, and a strong Secwepemc mother, that from the time that I was little, I was in a position of requiring an explanation. I had to consistently explain who I was, consistently make space for my voice, and consistently learn to conform for safety. And so I would say about 5 years ago, I started to recognize that actually I was really unwell, that I was physically not feeling good, that I was getting irritated with the recognition of labor, the entitlement that the white people around me felt that they had over my time and my labor, my wisdom. And I started to really focus in on my own learning. And so I think for me, that meant doing some really critical analysis about the ways in which my ability to conform to white spaces has benefited me. I am the CEO for a national charitable organization, and I fully recognize that my ability to do a thing like ace an interview had a lot to do with how well I can perform in those kinds of spaces, right? And so there's a lot of like ongoing labor that happens to make sure that I'm doing that. And I would say that it's not just because I'm biracial with a white father that I am required to do that work. I'm married to a cisgendered white man. My son is white presenting. You look at my son, you would have no way to tell that he is a Secwepemc young man. And so I've had to relearn the ideas that I had about indigeneity. I had to be compassionate about what that meant, but I also had to find language and practices that centered my own kind of embodiment.
Oh, I think Kris got frozen. Kris, can you hear us? Oh no, we lost Kris. I'm sure Kris will come back in a second. Yeah, I was thinking like as Kris was talking, and like I'm sure these are things that Shanice you could talk to, but like what are some really good examples of like being really close to whiteness and white privilege that you can think of off the top of your head? Because I feel like folks might not realize like how close they are to whiteness unless we really just, put it out there and say it really bluntly.
Yeah, for sure. I'm a biracial person as well. I'm light skinned. I'm racially ambiguous in some spaces. And so while I'm like black and indigenous, I still have proximity to whiteness because of the fact that I'm very light skinned. It's something that I also had to confront. My grandmother and my father are both dark skinned. They're from Trinidad, and my grandmother had to leave Trinidad to find a job because she couldn't get hired as a dark skinned black woman in Trinidad. And so, yeah, I think definitely like whether you're white passing or white presenting or light skin and your proximity to whiteness, I think it's really important to acknowledge like what roles you're taking on in organizations and like whether or not dark skinned folks or people who are more typically seen as native, right, are being passed over for positions for people who look like you, right? It's recognizing in spaces, are you speaking over other people? Like that's all in connection to whiteness, right? The space that you're taking up. I think oftentimes we don't think about this, but being able bodied and the way that is so connected to like whiteness, right, and this idea of like what is a human being that functions properly, right? Like all of these concepts that are very much connected to like white European ideals of like human identity. So being able-bodied, I think language, some of the things that we use. I saw a really funny meme and it was like, what's seen as a privilege if you're rich and seen as a disadvantage if you're poor, and it was speaking two languages. And I found that really funny. But it's interesting how class, we don't talk about class enough and how that is also connected to whiteness. And it's not to say that class didn't exist before white people or Europeans arrived in certain places, but the way in which it exists now is very different. I think it's important to acknowledge that. So if you're someone who's upper class, if you're walking past a person who is without a home, who's on the street, and you're choosing to ignore them, you're not acknowledging their existence, that is connected to whiteness, right? So I think it's just like, yeah, someone said neurotypical, all of these ideas of like white cis able-bodied men, right? And so I think it's really important to acknowledge those connections, right? Class, race, colorism, all of these things that connect you, education, right? And the ways the ways in which we look at education. So it's not to say that if you're educated you are therefore more white. That's like a really bad misconception, but I think it's the way in which we look at education, the way in which we devalue other forms of education. So traditional indigenous forms of education are not seen as valid. Even when we look at our elders that are working at universities and the way in which they're not paid in the same same way or aren't given tenure. So education does play a big role in the way in which whiteness is centered. Environmental racism. So if you have access to clean drinking water in a way in which someone in a poor neighborhood or on a reserve doesn't, that is a connection to whiteness, right? So I think it's really important to acknowledge that whiteness is not simply just being white, right? It's all of these social constructs that come with whiteness. It's the way in which you experience the world. If you're somebody who comes from a background that is racialized or stigmatized for religion purposes, but you walk into a space and no one would know that unless you said something, that is a connection to whiteness, right? How are you moving within that space? How are you making space for others?
Yeah, 100%. And so like for myself, I'm pretty white passing, and but one thing that happens is usually white folks don't think I'm white. But like people that are not white usually think I'm white. So it's like this weird situation. But I totally recognize that, you know, being kind of like that white in that white passing role, like it does give me privileges. And so when we do have privileges, you know, what's some like good advice you have on like trying to use your privilege to do something positive or create change or shift power?
So I think the first thing is to unpack that privilege, to really sit down and ask yourself, you know, how does this benefit me in the world, right? Like what does this privilege mean to me? It's very important that you move through that guilt real quick. It is not beneficial for anybody. Pascal Delivres, who is the co-founder and former member of Black Lives Matter Toronto, says that all of the time. Guilt is not a useful emotion, so it's really important that you move through that quickly. I think it's important to use your voice. If you are in a position of power, to use your voice to bring awareness to issues, and that doesn't mean speaking for people, but it means amplifying the voices that are already out there. So maybe you work for a company and you want to send out an article that's on Indigenous issues or Black issues or racialized issues through everyone in your organization or your department. Maybe it looks like I said before, if you're working at an organization and you're seeing that someone who is dark skinned, who is monoracially Indigenous, is constantly getting passed over for promotions or opportunities, speak up or give up your position if you are able to. I think it's really important to do that. Like if you see a promotion coming up and you can say no to it and you can offer it to somebody else, do that. I met with someone from the Justice Department and we were talking about a report that she was conducting. She was a settler and she was saying, oh yeah, it's probably going to sit on someone's desk for 2 years. And I said, well, what are you going to do about that? And she was like, well, I can't really do much. You know, I don't want to lose my job. And I was like, sometimes being an ally is losing your job. If you're going to allow a report on Indigenous youth in the prison system sit on a desk for 2 years, then you need to be doing more, right? And so it means being uncomfortable. It means having uncomfortable conversations. Like I said before, you can argue with somebody online for 2 hours, right? But are you arguing with your family members? Are you taking the time to sit and talk to your grandparents? I had someone reach out to me once. It was during I guess, the height recently of Black Lives Matter stuff. And they had said to me, you know, I'm trying to get your advice on where I should stop because it's getting really hard to talk to my family about their anti-Blackness and it's affecting my mental health. So is it okay if I just let them continue to be anti-Black because it's hard for me? And I was like, I'm definitely not the person for you to ask. As someone who also has mental health issues, it was weird to me having someone come to me and ask me as a Black person, like, what should be their limit on confronting their anti-Black family members. And I was like, if you think it's hard for your mental health, how do you think it is for me as I'm watching Black people die and you're asking me to comfort you in your inability to confront your family? And I understand mental health is important. I understand that, you know, confronting things need to be done from a safe place, but I think it's really important to remember, like, who are you centering in these conversations? And if you're centering your discomfort, then this isn't from a place of actually helping, right? So yes, definitely have conversations when you're able to, but definitely don't go to racialized folks to be like, hey, this is hard. can you help me? Like, we're not here to do the work for you, right? So yeah, I think it's really important. And I think it's also important to never get to a point where you think that you're done, right? Being in allyship or in solidarity with racialized and indigenous people or queer people, right? Or disabled people, it's a lifelong commitment. This never ends. It will never end for me. And so you being in solidarity with us is a never ending thing, right? There's a really great professor at the University of Regina. I can't remember his name. I feel like Brendan will know it. But he talks about being a recovering racist. And even though he has a brown wife and brown children, it is something he's constantly unpacking and will unpack for the rest of his life, right? So it's acknowledging that this is a lifelong process. And so, yeah, I think like those are some of the things that folks can definitely do. Yes, Dr. Michael Capello, I suggest all of the racialized and non-indigenous folks, and even actually everyone, I suggest everyone look into Michael Capello. He's an amazing professor. The first time I met him, I really like came at him because I was like, I don't need no white man to save me. And then I had a really in-depth conversation with him. And he's definitely someone I see as a person in solidarity with indigenous people. And he actually talks about, he does this event called It's Okay to Be Against Whiteness, and he talks about the social construct of whiteness. So I highly recommend him. Brendan's put his contact information in the chat, but definitely a person to look into if you're looking for more ways to be in solidarity without having racialized and indigenous folks forced to do the work.
Nice. I love how Brendan added his email and phone number. That's awesome. Thanks, Brendan. I think Kris is with us again. Is that you, Kris? Oh. Kris, can you hear us? Oh, no. Yeah, so I guess Kris is just having some problem with their Wi-Fi and stuff like that. But I think that's Kris that called in. So yeah, I had actually a situation that happened recently where I was trying to, in a really nice way, as always, really trying to educate my friend's partner about, you know, their whiteness and just some areas of improvement. And it kind of took like a turn for the worst, and it turned into this whole like you know, people started crying, and then all of a sudden I was a bully. And so I just wanted to like talk to you about that, like, you know, how I want to kind of talk about this idea of like an angry Native woman, you know, and how, you know, every time we bring up something in a really nice way, all of a sudden we're turned into like a bully or a diva, or we're seen as difficult.
Yeah, I'm Black and Native, so I've got like the double angry Black, angry Native woman. I definitely think it's been hard. I think especially when we're holding our own community accountable, we're seen as like using the white man's tool to like tear down our men or to tear down other folks in community. And that's a way that like whiteness is centered in a way to like silence Black and indigenous women and like Black and indigenous like two-spirit folks as well. This like weird like, well, if we're holding you accountable, right, all of a sudden we're white, we're doing the white man's work. It's like such like a big thing for some reason. I think the way I was able to get past that was really having conversations with my mom. My mom is a white passing indigenous woman, and we've had conversations about Blackness. And you know, I sat down with her and I was like, you know, like, did you think about what it meant to bring a Black child into this world? And one time we were at a museum exhibit and my mom was really upset by what was in there. It was around slavery. And I was like, Mom, I love you, but to be honest, like your opinion doesn't matter on this. And it's not because like I don't care about you or I don't value you, but it very much was about the fact that this was not a time to center herself. And we've had conversations, and she's cried, and you know, and it's hard as a daughter, right? Making your mother cry, I think has been very difficult for me, and I felt in the moment like a bully. But I think it was really important that my mom was able to sit there and go, no, I want to learn and I want to have these conversations, right? My mom was just at an event that I did on the weekend on Black activists in the Caribbean, and she sat and listened the whole time, and then we had a conversation afterwards. And so I think for me, that's how I got past it, was being able to have those hard conversations with my mom, and her response. And not everyone's going to be as great as my mom, right? Like some people are going to be like that and they're going to be upset, but I think it's important to push through that and speak your truth. And you know what, I talked to this one professor from Ryerson at an event, and I said, you know, I'm angry, and everyone keeps telling me that as I get older I'll be less angry. And she was like, I'm 62 and I'm still angry. Like, we have a right to be angry, right? Like, the things that we have endured, we have a right to be angry. I think whiteness oftentimes tells us that we have to turn the other cheek and that we have to forgive. And yes, that of course is among a lot of our teachings, right? Is that forgiveness, but also that anger is there too, right? And that's also medicine, and it's about how you use it, right? If that anger turns inward and you're harming yourself, that's not good medicine. But if that anger is going outwards and you're holding people accountable, right, and you're telling people to confront their whiteness, that's good medicine. And so I think it's important to remember that in those moments when people are trying to call you the angry native or the angry Black person, that's good medicine. Damn right I'm angry. Damn right I'm telling you about yourself. Damn right I'm going to collect you in your whiteness, right? So I think that's really important.
That's such a good way to put it. It's good medicine. So I'm gonna try to connect with Kris again. Yeah. Kris, I think you might have to unmute yourself. Oh, there we go.
Here I am.
Yay.
Yay. Fashion.
Yeah, so we're talking about a whole bunch of stuff. I apologize for just grilling you, Shanice. I feel like you probably need some water right now. But thanks for holding it down while we got Kris back. But yeah, Kris, what are some experiences you had with that kind of angry Native woman stereotype, and how have you kind of coped with it or gotten through it?
Well, similar to what Shanice is saying, I think it's important to embrace it. And I mean, more often than not, if I'm ever asked by someone who is white, like, well, why are you so mad about this? My question back to them is, why aren't you? That's actually the bigger problem here. How is it that we can have a conversation about how police are killing Black and brown women and men all across Canada, the US, and how could you not be angry? That is scarier and more concerning for me, that you're focused on my anger and frustration, but you're not feeling the rage. So I think that on one hand, it's like, yes, to embrace it. The other is to just really, flip it back on people in the space of how could you not be angry? And if you're not angry, if you don't feel rage about this, I think that part of the reason why it's medicine is because then I know that they're not my fucking people. They're not the people that I'm going to spend my time and energy with. I will not take my medicine and share it with folks whose eyes and ears are blind to the injustice that's happening so blatantly in the world today. So I do think that that's part of the strategy that I have. One of the things that I'm really fortunate to do is I'm paid well to work in what I call the philanthropic adjacent space. So we don't have money, we don't give it away, but we have the ability to influence and impact the settler philanthropic sector and how it is that they make decisions. So I'm paid well to go in and really force conversation and invite people into a space of learning and thinking and doing differently. And the fortune of what we get to do is we're a member-based organization. So I'm mostly surrounded by white folks who are like, yeah, we got to do something about this. This is messed up. This is not okay. And they're actually already they've already got their foot in the door, and they're already recognizing how they're complicit in upholding these shitty systems that cause harm, not only to Indigenous communities, but to all of humanity, right? Whether it's through their investing, their grant making, how they use or don't use our social capital, et cetera. So in those spaces, I think what's been really clear as a strategy is to invite folks to recognize that we are all, in fact, swimming around in the sea of white supremacy. And that when we can all see that we are both implicated and that we are complicit and that we are all harmed by it, I think that opens up a different pathway for conversation. I also have to acknowledge that the positional power that I have and that I take up in places is also used as a strategy. So, you know, supporting folks to learn about rank theory, to learn about the different ways that we can hold and embody power, right? I'm not talking just about like, you know, old white dude power who's just like entitled and thinks they got the answer to everything. I'm talking about like spiritual power, the power that comes from knowing your language and being connected to land, the kind of psychological power that means that you know the difference between what's right and wrong, and you're going to stand in your strength and talk about it and show people what they can do about it. So learning about power is really key. The other piece that's essential is being willing to recognize where you are complicit in harming others. So I've done a ton of work in the last few years coming to understand how I have harmed myself because of ableism. I'm hard of hearing, and only in the last 2 years have I actually been like, do I actually tell people and request accommodation and get it? And I turn down things if I don't get those accommodations. And I had to do a whole bunch of deconstruction about ableism. I was like harming myself because I had all of these like fucked up notions about what I should be able to do. The other piece is thinking about the way that patriarchy shows up, and like, when are there moments when I'm actually complicit in upholding patriarchy? When are there times when I'm thinking about like, for some reason, I think it should be a man who's talking to me about my finances, right? Like, that's so messed up. But I have to investigate those things because white supremacy is just one part of a system that causes us harm. There are so many others that exist. So yeah, the stereotype about me being, you know, an angry Native woman exists. And I tend to start lots of the talks that I'm doing by telling people straight up that I'm a cranky auntie, and that I'm fully aware of it and I fully embrace it.
Awesome. I love that. I wanted to kind of go back to, I don't even think we even touched on it fully yet, but something that you talk a lot about, Kris, is like decentering the whiteness in time. So yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about time.
Ooh, time. Well, I mean, so here's one of the ways that white supremacy shows up in organizations, but also in white bodies and in the way that the world is constructed. It's in urgency, right? So when I don't know how many of you have had the privilege to be in ceremony back home in your community, or in your urban community, or as you reconnect. But here's the magical thing about ceremony, right? Is like, it starts when it starts, and it takes as long as it takes. And when it's over, it's over. And that kind of relationship to time, to the tending to relationship and human body, and the requirement to make sure that work is done in the right way, means that I think that Indigenous and other communities have a different relationship to time. And the construct of time in this like Western European world is like pretty fucked up, right? Like it's so focused on scarcity, and that time is often, it's often used as a marker for things like progress. It's used as a marker for things like being able to demonstrate movement, to demonstrate someone's commitment. And you know, the idea of being on time, for example, is used as a marker for whether someone demonstrates respect or not. But I can tell you, like, folks talk about like, oh yeah, you know, they're on Indian time. And there's a chief out here in BC who often said, you know what, there's no such thing as Indian time, because if you think that we don't know the right time to begin, then guess what? We wouldn't still be here. We're here because we actually are in a way better relationship to the land around us, to our teachings, and to one another. So we know when the right time is to go and do the things we need to do. And if you've ever been to a bingo hall, like, we know our grannies show up early and they stay late. And so those conceptions are actually damaging to us, and they, especially if we embody them, like, you know, sometimes jokingly we embody the like, oh yeah, like here we are, we're late again. I think that actually discredits that we have deeper teachings about time and that we need to activate them. One of the things that I've been seeing a ton, and I'll apologize because I can't see your faces and I'm just standing and walking in my bedroom. I'm talking really fast. One of the other things I'll say about time is that right now, especially, there's a shit ton of urgency in the world, right? Like, everyone is like, oh my gosh, we have to do this thing. It needs to happen super fast. What happens when you work quickly outside of relationship, like outside of deep, trusting, you know, meaningful relationship, is that you perpetuate harm, right? Like, if you're not being thoughtful because speed is more important than having the right people at the table, if speed is more important than making sure that you're not replicating harm, then you're definitely going to do those things. And so in the work that we do, you know, we have folks who will say, you know, it's really urgent and important that we do A, B, and C. And my first question is like, well, who do you have the relationships with that can cultivate that speed? Now, if you don't have the relationships with BIPOC communities to cultivate the decision-making that you want to move at the pace you want to move at, then guess what? You got to slow down, because your work is far from done. And chances are the work actually needs to go like way more internal for folks than external. So I would say that the resources by Tema Akun and a handful of other folks that list the characteristics of how white supremacy shows up inside of organizations are a really great benchmark for understanding how they show up inside of us under moments of stress and duress. But just having the language to put your finger on it and go like, oh, this is what we're doing right now. And to recognize that you can choose something different, just getting into the pattern of that becomes like a bit of, it's like an addicting elixir, right? You start to do it and you're like, ooh, that's yummy. I want to do that again because I don't like how I feel over there. It's harmful. It hurts me. My head aches. My body is frustrated when I'm in that space. Like, if I get a little taste of this medicine, I'm not going back. So I think that all that to say, understanding our relationship to time is essential, because the other thing that happens is when we're in good relationship, things can absolutely happen at the speed of light, and that there are some things like that can't happen unless you're at that quality of relationship. You know, a couple months ago, we had a gathering called the Racial Equity and Justice and Philanthropic Funder Summit, which is a big badass name, but basically it was a handful of, you know, mostly women, mostly racialized women, who leaned on the relationships that we have with other amazing BIPOC folks to put on an event that hosted hundreds of participants from Canada, the US, and even folks from Europe. And that would never have been possible if it was running on the notion of time that, like, you know, nonprofit or philanthropic organizations think things need to go on, because, you know, they take 18 months to plan a 2-day conference. And they're like, oops, like, most of our speakers were white and we had no accessibility recognition. And like, so many Black and brown people were harmed just by the interactions, like, over meal times. And so again, like, sometimes organizations use time as a barrier to meaningfully engage people. But as BIPOC folks, I think we have beautiful relationship to time, and we need to embody it, empower it, and recognize that if we fall under the notion of urgency led by whiteness, we're going to do harm to ourselves and to our people.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kris, for talking about all of that. I think I could really relate to that idea of like having relationships in place before like the timeline. And so I feel like that's something we do really well with A7G. We have really great relationships with young people, and they are the ones who tell us what timeline we're supposed to be working on, not the other way around. It's not like here's the timeline we have to meet, and so we need to fit Indigenous youth into these little boxes. And then people always ask us like, oh, how do you do things so quickly? And it's like, that's how we do things so quickly, because we have relationships with each other. So I really appreciate that. Yeah, and Shanice, did you want to touch on time a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. I feel like I've also just like learned so much from Kris listening to her talk. I was like, damn. But yeah, I think as someone who's also Black, right? Like Caribbean time or Black people time is also something that we have, that concept. And I've always like noticed the way in which time differs for me when I'm in the Caribbean versus when I'm here. And I think it definitely has to do with that overproductivity that's like pushed into this very like capitalistic way of being, and how time is like a part of that, and the way in which it isn't in the Caribbean. Like, I think of all the time that you have back home to be with family and be with community in a way in which that you don't here. But I also think that like when we're talking about time, also the time frame that's given to Black and Indigenous people or queer folks, around when they're allowed to talk about their issues, it's like there's always this time constraint, right? Like February is Black History Month, so that's the only time we should be hearing from Black people, right? And June is Indigenous Peoples Month, but like kind of, we might want to hear from you just a bit, but really we just want to see you dance and sing, right? Is this like this time frame of when we're allowed to talk about things? It's like with the Truth and Reconciliation, like that was Indigenous people's time, so like shut up, why are you still talking, right? And so I think it's the way in which whiteness constrains our ability to talk about our oppression and our ability to talk about the things that we're facing, right? It's, we only get a limited amount of time to be able to talk about the things that we face. And I think that's one of the ways in which white supremacy uses time to silence people. I think it's really important to acknowledge that, right? Especially like recently, you see now that Black Lives Matter has started to die down, right? The media attention, and that very much has to do with time. It very much has to do with the time in which non-Black folks were willing to give Black people, right? A couple of months, maybe 3 months, you're pushing it. We're now how many months later, and people don't have the quote unquote time anymore to care about Black people, about Black lives, right? And you see that happening with Indigenous people as well. People don't have the quote unquote time to care. And that very much is something that's pushed by white supremacy, is our ability to allocate time to caring about each other. And that once again ties into capitalism, right? We don't have enough time, even as Black and Indigenous people, we don't have enough time to care for ourselves because we're constantly on the go. We're in a society that doesn't give you time to rest, that doesn't give you time to heal, right? I always say that like racialized, like specifically Black and Indigenous people, we haven't had a time to collectively heal as people, right? We haven't had that time. And like Kris said, like for us time doesn't function in the same way, right? People expect us to heal over a day or a week or from one apology, and it takes time, it takes that relationship, it takes that community, it takes that kinship. So yeah, I think it's really important to acknowledge the way in which white supremacy and whiteness uses time to stop us from being able to heal, to stop us from being able to bring up the issues that we have, that stops us from being able, to hold them accountable. Time is definitely used, and it's also used to stop us from being able to be accountable to each other.
Yeah, for sure. I've never been to the Caribbeans, but the only island I can think of that's similar to the way you described that island time is in Manitoulin. So my husband's from Wikwemkong, and I always notice that when I go to the island, and I think a lot of it has to do with there's actually no like there's very few large corporations that are on the island, and so I just have come to the conclusion that that's why it has a time of its own way of being. So I wanted to check with Kelly and check how you're doing.
Thumbs up, just working to keep up. Sure, thank you. I do not feel any pressure of time. When it's done, it's going to be done.
Awesome. So I wanted to maybe open it up for some questions. And just a reminder, like if you have questions that you feel okay with being recorded, feel free to ask them now, and then we can also do some more after. So yeah, I'll open it up for like public questions right now. Oh, and Michelle, did you had your hand up for a while. Did you want to share something?
Yeah, I wanted to say, like, this has been really great. I'm Chinese, but a lot of the indigenous sort of history that I've been like relearning and unlearning and all of that have been really resonating with like remedies that I use on my own. Like I like to use natural remedies as opposed to the and I wanted to talk on the time that you mentioned of like how a lot of our capitalist society relates in all sectors, especially health. So like taking a pill when you have a migraine as opposed to like looking at the rooted issue of where did that come from? Why does that happen? Or taking time off. And then also if you work in like public sector or maybe like nonprofit sector sometimes, and myself being a student as well, like there's this, oh, when are you coming back? Like, you know, we'll hire someone else per se. And there's always constantly this like worry of like all of them coming together. So I really resonated with that. And on the conversation of accessibility, I personally, I'm part of the neurodiverse community. Was not proud before, but very proud now, and coming into a space of empowerment for others. And yeah, I think for my personal, I think it's about constantly bringing it up, even though in some spaces I might be removed from meetings. I am someone who will constantly bring up the accessibility specifically because I truly believe that when we want to have these conversations, especially these hard conversations, as technology is still a privilege. And when we talk about Indigenous, there's a lot of reserved meetings that I've attended for my initiatives. And there's a lot of people that are still like getting Wi-Fi from public buildings if they live on the reserves. So just like communication is like key, and like the accessibility. And another thing about it is like it's so one of the main things I've been getting, like the main excuses, I guess you could say, is like, oh, we don't have enough money. We're running on one person type of, and every space that I go to, and I constantly advocate for the Canadian Sign Language, you know, the Quebec Sign Language, as well as the simultaneous interpretation and the closed captioning, and then following up if they're going to do it in other languages, because I think decolonizing is kind of recentering, I guess not centering, I guess like realigning where we got the idea of like English being the dominant narrative and having to be the dominant narrative. Like all of the research, all of everything is English, and I guess like as someone who's immigrant settler, I'm trying to learn Indigenous languages right now. So I'm starting with Anishinaabe, and I will keep going, but that's, yeah. So I think like recentering those languages is definitely being a big key in relation to traditions and culture. And yeah, so I guess, sorry, my question is, what are some tips to keep it going, and not to put additional work, but I guess I personally have been trying, I'm in different roles. So sometimes I'm in the so-called directorial role. Sometimes I'm in the volunteering role. But I never want to be like, you know, the authoritative one, like you have to do this and you have to do this, because I believe it comes from like within. So like you want to do it, it'll come. But I kind of get frustrated when people like kind of like ask me for the resources, or like, you know, so what are ways to like lightly influence but intrinsically empower them to do the work, I guess. And them being like like maybe younger people who are maybe like still afraid of the hierarchy, or um sort of like my white allies, so-called. Yeah. Sorry.
Hey, this
Yeah.
is Kris. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So a couple of just quick comments on that. Like, I appreciate asking the question about how to tips on like supporting other white folks to do the work. I think it is really important to acknowledge that as a settler, as a white person, it's really important that, like, first and foremost, you do your own work. And secondarily, what we recommend in the work we do with folks in the settler philanthropic space is that after doing your own work, the next place for you to do your work is with your family, because your values, your behaviors, your beliefs, the way in which your learning has been shaped by the people around you is paramount. And so, you know, most people actually skip the idea of doing the work and having tough conversations with their family because they're like, oh my gosh, Uncle Bob is just so racist, I'm not even going to bother anymore. Well, rather than giving up on that, if you recognize that in some ways your family setting is like a dojo. It's a learning ground for you to be a warrior and to figure out what your moves are going to be, right? These are people you see all the time. You're going to keep seeing them. And I think one of the things to recognize is, like, it's not necessarily the job of white folks to convince other white folks. It's like, first do your own work within your families, and actually just like make visible the learning that already exists by other white folks to keep doing that work. I think when it comes down to it, like, and again, I recognize that my positional power and my age and my cranky auntie status just means that I have less patience for this. But I don't suffer any fools. Like, if someone is going to try and sea lion me, or someone is going to try and keep me busy by saying, like, ooh, I don't understand, can you like say it differently? Or can you do a workshop about white supremacy but not call it white supremacy? I'm very clear about saying, like, no. Like, if you can't deal with the language that I need to use to be aligned in my body for my well-being and my sanity, then the answer here is no, you got your own work to do. But the other thing is, like, I also don't have any time for people who aren't ready to show up and do the work. And so I've been known to, like, people ask me a question and I'll send them a recommendation for an article or a book and say, after you've read this, I'm happy to have a conversation with you. But until such time, no thanks. And it also means that with my, like, white friends and family members, that I'll often say to folks who ask me questions, my first question back will be like, have you Googled that? I bet if you Googled it, you find something out, and then you don't have to take my time to find that answer. And secondarily, I've even just said to people, you know what, like, we're okay friends, but we're not the kind of friends where I'm going to give of my time and labor in this way. And so I just really invite you to do your own work with your own people right now. And for folks who just don't get it, I don't put my energy there. My life force and my energy and my wisdom is better spent with folks who are ready to show up and do the work. All of the space of existing in hypervigilance, of trying to convince people of our humanity, that's not time I'm going to put towards folks like that in the world anymore. So I just give people, like, you know, some invitation and some permission to awaken your inner auntie and just say, like, fuck this. Like, I'm not giving people that time, and I'm only going to seek to work alongside folks who are ready to do their own learning.
Yeah, I'm definitely gonna echo Kris. I think something that I learned from Black feminists on Facebook was, like, they just started sending people their, like, PayPal or Cash App. When people ask questions, they just sent that, and we're like, I will give you the information once you pay me, because I am not here to teach you for free. Also, like Kris said, Google. I've sent Google many a times to people. I had someone once messaging me asking me about Navajo spirits, and I was like, I can't tell you, because I was like, I too shall Google this answer for you, because I'm not Navajo. And so I think it's really important to do that. I think when it comes to like educating people who actually want to do the work, meet them where they're at. I think it's really easy for us to get caught up, especially those of us who are in like social justice spaces or who have gone to post-secondary. It's really easy for us to get caught up in using very like academic terms like intersectionality, or even like saying white supremacy. Like talking to my grandmother who's from Trinidad, like white supremacy was not the term to use to get her to understand the oppression that she had faced in Trinidad at the hands of Indo-Caribbean people, right? So it really took me meeting my family members and meeting community members where they were at to have conversations around things like this, to make sure that I wasn't speaking over their head. Because oftentimes, like I said, I think it's easy for us to get caught up in these academic terms, or even the articles that we're sending to folks, right? A lot of it at times can be very like high level academic that like even I have a hard time understanding, that I have to Google the terms myself. So I really think yeah, see, my mom does that too, Brennan. Yeah, I think it's really hard sometimes when we do that. So I think it's really important to like meet folks where they're at when educating them. You said that you are Chinese. I think something that was really dope that the Asian community did during the height of Black Lives Matter back in, I think it was like 2014, is that they had written in their like Asian languages, so whether they were Chinese or whether they were South Asian, they had written in their languages to their elders and to family members to articulate it in a way that met them where they were at, right? So instead of like trying to force them to understand through English, yeah, having those conversations, right? I think it's really important that if you can do it in the language that is comfortable for them, do that. I think once again, what Kris said, when it comes to white people, or just anyone, if you can tell that they're not ready to be there, don't kill yourself or burn yourself out trying to get them there, right? You can easily just send them a link, be like, here's the information. If you want to have a conversation after you've read it, then we can. But until then, this is the extent of my teaching you. I think it's really important. You're not a professor. I mean, you might be a professor, but in that moment, you're not a professor. You're not a guest lecturer. You're not getting compensated for this time other than stress. And so, yeah, I think it's really important to make sure that you are meeting people where they are at, that you are, and that also means that their capacity to want to learn, and that you're not using overly social justice-y, even though that's not really a word, but social justice-y academic terms to articulate yourself.
Yeah, I've literally just thought about sending people invoices at this point. Like, and I think even some people have been breaking down like what an invoice for, like, basically what you're doing on a personal level is like cultural competency training, and people get paid like a lot of money to do that. So don't undervalue yourself. And on that note too, you can give information to someone, but you also don't need to validate it. Like, you don't have to be like a sounding board whether they've actually learned it or not. And so it's not your responsibility to keep track of their learning journey. Like, you don't need to give people gold stars or like stickers. So please don't engage in that. Let them do that on their own. And yeah, just meet people where they're at. I also think it's really important that, racism is actually white supremacy. Like, they're the same things. It's just that in a lot of spaces, people prefer to use like racism. Some people don't even use that word, or they like to use diversity and things like this and really like to sugarcoat things. But like, let's literally think about, where did racism come from? So white people created racism. So it's really white supremacy. And so I really love how Kris was talking about, just calling it how it is. Nothing's going to change if we keep sugarcoating stuff. Yeah, so miigwech for sharing all that. Hi. Yeah, does anybody have any other questions before we turn off the live recording? Okay, cool. So before I turn off the live recording, I'll just go to Shanice and Kris for some final closing words. And it looks like, Kris, you're ready to go.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to to respond to some of what Shanice is saying around meeting people where they're at. And I think I hold kind of two specific practices around that notion. One is in my own community of Indigenous folks, or the community of like BIPOC folks that I build alongside and I'm in deep relationship with, I find that actually more often than not, people have way more capacity than we give them credit for. And it's actually the language that we use that creates barriers, right? But if you talk with people honestly about like when they've experienced injustice or when they can feel in their body that something is not okay, like most humans have the capacity to express that like they have a distinct knowing of when they're getting fucked over or like when someone's going to cause them harm. And so, you know, in our own communities, I think it's really important to think about the use of language and to recognize that if we're not careful in the like kind of, I'm using air quotes here, in the progressive, like left-leaning community, we actually can exclude our potential allies and supporters. And I think that's really important to just recognize that. The other though is when I'm working with white folks, I actually I refute the idea of meeting them where they're at, because meeting them where they're at is causing harm to my body, right? It's like why I do this work is because I don't trust where they're at, because where they're at causes harm to me and my people. So this beautiful coach and facilitator and strategic thinker named Beena Patel of Sati Impact, she uses this language around like, I don't want to meet you where you're at. I want you to come to where I'm at. And I want us to build towards the future, right? So it's like, we have to get aspirational with people. And if we choose to spend our time and energy being hypervigilant and irritated and frustrating and trying to educate the people who don't actually want to be educated, if we took that energy and actually focused on what a liberated future for ourselves looks like and focus our energy there, I think more folks will look at that and go, holy shit, that's where I want to be. I want to head there. So sometimes the language of meeting people where they're at is actually, it gives people an excuse to keep up their shitty behavior, right? And so we have to like give ourselves permission to be like, yo, where you're at is messed up. So you got to go away and do this work. And then when you show up, we can get back to building an aspirational, like liberated future together. So just wanted to add that piece. The other piece, Shanice, is like, I just really fucking love hearing from you. You're a brilliant speaker and a thinker. And I'm so excited that, Gabby, that you've invited us to connect and riff, because I've learned so much as well from you today, Shanice. So thank you. And that's all I'll say. Thanks again for the invitation here. Kuchtem.
That's awesome. I love that liberated future. That's what I want to see too. And I agree. I think we should be working towards that instead of doing this heavy lifting that's not even helping us build anything. But yeah, go to you, Shanice. Some closing words.
I just want to say Chimigwich, Kris. Like, I feel like I'm here in the presence of like this like great forward like thinker, and I'm just like learning so much. So to hear you say that, like, I genuinely, yeah, I'm just taking that in. That means so much. So Chimigwich. Yeah, I definitely 1000% agree with Kris. When I'm saying meet people where they're at, I definitely fully mean community. I don't have the time. Like I said, I don't argue with white people online anymore. It has been the best thing for my health. But yeah, I think something that I want to leave folks with, especially, actually no, everyone, whiteness, this is something I can't stress enough. Whiteness is a social construct. It is something that severely harms everybody. And while white people benefit from whiteness, it is something that is also extremely harmful for themselves, because of all of the other things that come with whiteness, right? Ableism, homophobia, transphobia, all of these other things. So I really want folks to, you know, and maybe they can do this tonight, maybe they do it over the weekend, but I want you to like take the time to really envision what a future looks like without whiteness. And so white people, that doesn't mean you aren't there. I mean, sometimes for me, that's what it does mean, but I think you can take the time to also sit there and ask yourself, what does a future without whiteness look like? right? And I don't want you to sit there and like picture, you know, all of the things that whiteness represents. I want you to just picture yourself, picture your family, picture your community, and how are they? How are they thriving? What's present? What is present in this future, right? You, yourself, is it laughter? Is it joy? Is it returning back to traditional forms of governance, right? What does this future without whiteness look like for you? And then I want you to start to write down the steps that you can take to make it happen. And I think that's something that we all have to do. Manifesting is such a great tool that I think a lot of us sometimes forget about. But I think it's something that we all can individually take steps towards, right? And what does that future look like for you? And what are the steps that you can take right now to start to move towards that future, right? And so maybe it looks like your home is a no white people home, or maybe it looks like having those hard conversations with your family, right? What are the steps that you can take? And so that's something I want to leave for everyone, myself included, is picturing that future and what you can do to move towards it. So yeah, Chimigwich for having me.
Awesome, Miigwech. Hi. So I'm gonna pass it off to you, Kelly. Did you want to walk us through what you've captured so far?
Sure. So I'm gonna turn the laptop. So there was a lot to capture. So we have two charts coming together. Let's see. I don't know if it'll be a mirror image, but we have a little bit about, can I flip it? I'll figure this out. Is it backwards, everybody? No, it's right way. So we started with talking about spaces that favor, you know, what is this? What is decentering whiteness? So spaces that, you know, favor the needs of BIPOC folks first and foremost, and center their comfort first and foremost. And Kris really talked about the love of that work and how it's worth it. And Shanice talked about centering indigeneity as building relationships, focusing on kinship. It's a building, nation building, and building up each other. So not reconciling in a way that centers whiteness, but reconciling in a way that we build up each other and reconcile nations. And then started talking about or went into creating safe spaces for each other, for BIPOC folks, creating no white folks spaces and safety. Stop arguing online. These are important practices for our well-being, and to practices to guide us forward. Know that racism is everywhere, so we don't need to look for it. We don't need to like look for confronting it. It's exhausting and not sustainable. And ensure that in the process, the most radical thing we can do is, let's see, is to feel joy. Let's see, we have a little guy there. Feel joy and breathe and fully embrace it. Talking about the most important teaching is that when we're thinking about comfort, that there's going to be a lot of discomfort, but there is a lifelong commitment to this process. And there's a little guy with some medicine, spreading it all around and thinking about all these things that are good medicine. That includes anger, that our allies don't get to quit when it's hard, that sometimes using your power is giving it up, and that we got to move through guilt real quick. An important piece or practice for ourselves is confronting our own proximity to whiteness all of the time and thinking about our roles. Ableism has come up a lot, and ability, which I really appreciate, as the mother of two very neurodiverse humans who are amazing. And in doing that, we're thinking about access to education, access to spaces, who is hired, who is paid, and confronting whiteness is confronting our own whiteness and how we're moving into this space. And when we were talking about anger as a good medicine, you know, turning it back around, how can you not be angry? I get to be angry, and how are you not? And then the other chart, we started talking about time and notions of time. And I really love this, and thinking about how ceremony has its own time, and that supremacy pushes notions of scarcity and urgency and speed, which causes us to replicate harm to one another. And it shows up in us and our organizations, and this idea of overproductivity and our relationship with time. But what's really important is thinking about the way that whiteness limits how we can speak and take up space, when what we most need is time to care and collectively heal. Thinking about that relationship is really what centers the time. It's what leads the timeline. And Gabby, you talked about how that created way more efficiency and creates more efficiency, is the relationship and centering the folks. When we're doing our work and people are coming up to us and approaching us, we put it back to them. We put the responsibility back in them. First, do your own work, and then consider working with your family, who are like the ones most adjacent to practice or work with. Work with those who are ready, and work with where they're at. But know that racism is white supremacy, and we're not going to sugarcoat it. That other people's learning is not your labor and not your responsibility. I love this idea. So last, we're closing with this really aspirational thought by both Kris and Shanice of moving towards an aspirational, liberated future, a future without whiteness. And I can get behind that. I'm picking up what you are putting down. So I'll digitize all that and make it look like super pretty. And thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your words.
Amy Gwitch, this is amazing. Oh my gosh.
Thanks so much, everyone. Just stick around. I'm gonna turn the recording off,